Hi Maria, this is Ira, and I'm recording here audio feedback on your statement of belief, which I hope will be helpful as you complete these final revisions on your major essay for the course, the Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay. I really enjoyed reading this statement, and so I'm looking forward to reading your larger theoretical statement as well. And so I wanted to provide this feedback with an eye not to evaluating the statement of belief, but rather to offering some suggestions or thoughts, things to focus on, ways of systematizing some of your considerations here that I hope will be helpful to have in mind while you're doing these final revisions on the major essay. So basically what I'm going to do is read back through this statement of belief and highlight some of the things that you're saying and that I think are strong and interesting, and then also note a few places where I want to push you or challenge you a little bit to think more systematically or to specify how this plays out in digital contexts. And I think, one of the things that's pretty cool and interesting about this statement of belief is that you really kind of trace out different kinds of arguments in a way that acknowledges that different arguments sort of have different conditions and different purposes, and it's hard to really even think about what would make them all good per se. And within that context, you highlight that what sort of makes good arguments good is that they hold their own air of necessary respect and civility, and then you kind of look at some of the ways that cashes out differently. So in particular, you note that when our beliefs are called into question, we often feel completely blindsided, especially when called out by someone we know personally. And then you talk, and I think this is really interesting. You say, when confronted via the internet, anyone can take their time to reply, and in that time, research new arguments, refresh their facts, clearly articulate everything they want to say by reading it out and rewriting until their argument is clear and concise. And so you say this, and I think you're right. I mean, that is exactly what arguing in digital context affords us. And yet, it seems like we so rarely do that. At least when you read other people's arguments, and certainly thinking about some of my own arguments online, both good ones and ones that were maybe not as good, it seems like our arguments in digital spaces are often extremely fast-paced. So it's interesting that on the one hand, we have this reflective possibility or opportunity. You're exactly right. And on the other hand, we also tend not to use it a lot of the time. And so it might be interesting to think about what implications that has for good argument in digital contexts, or for what we should count as good argument in digital contexts. So like a lot of this stuff that happens when arguing in person, I think also does happen online, or does happen in digital contexts. So another thing that I think is really cool that you do is you look at the ways in which the different interactions or the different kinds of interpersonal relationships we have structure what we think is going to count as civility and respect, and structure how much civility or respect that we're liable to give. And so I think that's interesting and useful. And at the same time, I want to kind of push you a little bit to think, okay, so what does that mean about goodness? Are those all structured in some way by the same notion of the good? Or do you have a different concept of goodness for every single kind of argument? Do you have as many concepts of good argument as you have kinds of argument or individual arguments? Surely there's some kind of current or pattern or strain that runs through, and it seems like civility or respect is really important to the way that you think about argument. But why? Who cares? Why does respectfulness matter to you, to your thinking about good argument? You say in some cases, like a troll, where there's no kinship and therefore no need to feel particularly guilty for any ill-mannered behavior or underhanded comment. Is that good, though, by your definition? If it is, why? And if it's not, why not? And what is good? And why is that other thing good that's not this thing? So in other words, really what I'm kind of, looking to see in that defining good argument in digital context essay is a stronger sense of exactly what you think good argument is and why across contexts or across interaction types. Whether you're arguing with a one-on-one with a close relative or you're part of like a 30-person anonymous argument on Reddit or Tumblr or wherever. So again, that's not a statement that your statement of belief should have been different. I think you were thinking in a really interesting and useful way here. This is great. And for the major essay, since you're developing a theory, that's your theory of good argument, what I really want to push you to do is make sure that you're moving beyond just describing what happens in different contexts to articulating your own sense of the good and why whatever you think is good is something other people should take seriously or even adopt. And then the next thing, I thought this was fascinating. When you talk about your own experience of the difference between being added on Tumblr and being added on Instagram. You say, anytime I've been added on my Tumblr, I've tried to respond with reason and understanding. However, on my Instagram, I completely ignore the troll and block them. And you say, why do I do this? Honestly, I'm not sure. Which is, again, totally reasonable. Your statement of belief is just starting to think through this stuff. Now, be sure. Let's figure this out. Why do you do that? What's at stake? How does good argument work differently on these different platforms, and why? What principles are the same in those two very different behaviors? What are you hoping for or hoping to avoid? What sense of good argument runs through or motivates your behavior in these different spaces? Likewise, also back in sort of real-time interpersonal face-to-face argument. Although, of course, again, our focus in the major essay is much more on the digital contexts. Now you say, once I have been confronted, I often feel myself get defensive and completely block off any evidence of a counter-argument. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that that's good or bad? I mean, obviously, you seem to think that it's bad, but if so, why is it bad? Who cares? Why shouldn't you do that? Or should you do that? And if you should do that, why is that good or acceptable? How do we negotiate that attitude, that experience of feeling defensive? How should we, in your view? And again, as always, I'm not really asking you to parrot back to me what you think, I think. Who cares what I think? I'm interested genuinely in you figuring out in a systematic, thorough way that is both contextualized like you're doing here, but also sees patterns and similarities in your own values and beliefs and attitudes across contexts, figuring out what it is that you think. If this is good, why is this good? If it's bad, why is it bad? What vision or notion or concept of good argument makes it a good or bad thing to do? And I think, so for instance, you say, do Trump supporters deserve to have their opinions heard? I think a lot of people would argue no. And maybe you're right? So I'm not saying you're wrong, but if that's the case, why? Why are you right if you think that that's right? If you think that there are instances, some types of argument that we should always reject, refuse to listen to, so on and so forth, why? What is the vision of the good that makes that acceptable or permissible or appropriate? And so again, one of the things that the core thing that I'm encouraging you to do in that major essay in your final revisions now is take the work that you've done in that major essay and take these comments that I'm offering here in the spirit not of criticism of the statement of belief, because it's a great statement of belief. You're thinking about this stuff in really interesting ways. But take these comments as the kinds of questions you need to ask to create a systematic theory of good argument, which is ultimately your goal in the major essay. And I encourage you to think a little bit here about your own way of talking about effectivity, and maybe to think about that sort of potential conflict between effectivity and ethics, and how that plays into what you think arguments are for and what you think makes arguments good, specifically in digital contexts. Thanks a lot, and I really enjoyed reading this, and I'm looking forward to reading the major essay.